Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Uroš Anđelić, and I work at Quantox Technology. I am a backend developer, and I mainly work in PHP. The framework that I'm most familiar with is Laravel, and this talk will be about what I have learned while working on setting up a Node application with TypeScript. If you have any questions at any point during this presentation, feel free to type them in chat, and we will go through them at the end. But it will be better to write them at the end of the presentation so that there is less chance that I might miss it. So let's get started. Lately, I've been interested in Node.js for several reasons. I like the concept of Node. I like that it has a large community. And also, JavaScript is the language for web development. It is still pretty much the only option in front end, and it is one of the best options for backend development. Coming from PHP, I have some expectations when it comes to development workflow. I expect a certain quality in frameworks or any kind of library code that I use. In short, it mostly comes down to productivity. Having the best possible framework in which I can be productive is probably the most important thing to me. PHP indeed allows you to be very productive, but the Laravel framework is what multiplies that productivity by a lot. Laravel basically gives you all the tools that we need for web development, and those tools are built in a way that lets us use them in the simplest way possible and be super productive. But it also allows us to make scalable and maintainable apps. To be fair, Laravel also uses a lot of magic methods, which reduces the maintainability a little bit. So why would someone switch to another framework or even another language? Well, that's what I'll try to answer here. Please keep in mind that a lot of things that I'm going to say are just my opinions. There is, of course, no single best technology. There is only the best technology for a specific task and for a specific team or person. And most of the time, the answer is just use what you know best, but also sometimes there is a need for change. Laravel is a fully fledged web framework. What it means is that it gives you all the tools you need to make a complete web application. It uses MVC architecture. It includes inversion of control, routing, middleware, CSRF protection, validation, database communication, its own template engine, and much, much more. Some features can be turned off if needed. There is even a lightweight version of Laravel called Lumen. And if you need something even lighter than that, then perhaps you don't need a framework at all. Laravel is built in PHP, which makes it easy to deploy. It's also easy to get started with. It does not have a steep learning curve. You can pretty easily create a basic web application. It has great documentation, and it has a big community. It is fun. It is indeed very fun to work in Laravel, at least for me. Basically, PHP is not super fun for me. I don't like some of its design choices, but Laravel fixes a lot of those things that I didn't like. Before we start talking about Node, I would like to talk about other languages that I considered. Actually, I only considered Python. Other options were either too complex for my needs, not mature enough, or just not popular enough. Basically, I think if you want to build a backend app, I would stick to PHP, Node, or Python. Python is actually a great language to get into, not just for web development, but as a general purpose language. So, why change to Node.js? Well, you can have one language for both front-end and back-end. One language is easier to work with than two. It just is. Even if you have dedicated front-end and back-end developers on a project, even if you have separate apps for front-end and back-end, having to work with one language makes things easier. Now, to make a small website, you don't really need to complicate things. Maybe WordPress or something similar is enough. Maybe you want Maybe you know Laravel or any other framework, and you just want to build a small or even medium website with it, and that's fine. And that is probably the best solution. Use what you know and what will get the job done in the least amount of time. A bit of PHP, a bit of jQuery, and a bit of CSS, and you're done. But if you're building a bigger, modern, feature-rich web app, if you want a single-page application, if you want to make a REST API or GraphQL API, if you want, God forbid, microservices, then you need to think about which technologies to use. How important is performance to you? How many users will you have? Do you need real-time data like notifications, maybe a chat? There are many problems to solve and many different solutions for each problem. The things that were important to me are simplicity. As I said, one language is easier to work with than two. If I'm to build something myself or with one or two more people, we need as little variables as possible, and using one language is better than using two. Popularity. When I get stuck, will I find a solution online? To be fair, Laravel has an advantage here compared to any other backend Node.js framework. But as a whole, JavaScript community is bigger. The idea was not to find a bigger community than the one for PHP and Laravel, but to find one that is as good as possible. Speed. Well, let me tell you first that the speed of a language is very rarely a limiting factor in backend apps. All popular languages are fast enough in the vast majority of cases. The thing is that most of the time, backend apps are mostly I/O bound, which means that most of the time the app is waiting for data from the database or another service. The actual CPU time is a small part of every request. So the speed of a language itself does not impact the server time much. But a big difference is in how PHP and Node.js work. In PHP, for every request to the server, a new PHP process is started, PHP files are interpreted, the code is executed, the whole framework is bootstrapped, and only then the business logic is executed and a response is created. And in big frameworks like Laravel, the bootstrapping of the framework takes a solid chunk out of every response time. So again, for every single request, a new PHP process is started and the whole framework is bootstrapped from scratch. There are, of course, ways to reduce the impact of these things, but it cannot be removed completely. On the other hand, a node process is started once, the framework boots up, and then it's ready to process requests. The process is alive as long as possible. For every request that comes in a node server, only the business logic is executed and the response is created for every request. Also, Node uses an event loop to handle requests, which is a really efficient way for a web application to handle requests. And with async and await, development is very straightforward. So with Node, building apps is simple like with PHP, but it has performance like, for example, Java. When I say performance like Java, I mean in the world of backend services. Now, which is simpler between Node and PHP depends on what you're making. I would say PHP is simpler than Node in most cases, for example, like regular websites. So in general, Node is much faster than PHP, several times faster. It's not easy to say how much faster. It depends on a lot of things and will be different in different cases. But one guy on the internet said it's 5 to 20 times faster, and even more than that in some cases. Preference. So this is a personal thing, but a very important one. It matters what you like to work with. I believe one should work in technologies that are fun to him or her, if one can, because fun gives you motivation. Motivation leads to productivity, and productivity gives results. so don't ignore what you actually like. WebSockets, basically the real-time stuff. So chats, push notifications, and anything else the server wants to send to the user without the user asking for information. Both PHP and Node.js have libraries that allow working with WebSockets, but the PHP one is used much less than the Node one. Even when the main app is made in Laravel, the real-time communication is usually handled by a separate Node.js application or a third-party service. Without getting into details, it is just something Node is much better suited at than PHP. So why not Express or Koa or any other micro framework? Well, these frameworks are very useful for many things. Almost every Node app example on the internet uses Express. This is because Express gives us a basic API for working with middleware and routing, which are quite essential features for a backend app. But other than that, it does not provide much more. It gives you too much freedom to organize code however you want. A lot of packages need to be added to work with database, version of control, validation, and so much more. And if you want to work with TypeScript, that makes things a little bit harder. There are TypeScript starters online, and it is not difficult to set them up, but it is a bit better if the framework itself is built in TypeScript. Again, Express is the most popular backend framework, and for a reason. There are a lot of use cases where it is the best option, but it wasn't the best option in my case. So if not Express, what then? The answer is Nest.js. And there are many reasons why this framework is really good. It's built in TypeScript, which allowed it to use its features for a lot of architecture decisions. There is a defined way to organize code, which is flexible enough so that custom things can be done. It uses both OOP and functional programming principles. Contains a lot of features that don't come with Express, like validation, caching, logging, queues, and so on. One big thing is that other than REST, it supports GraphQL, WebSockets, and microservices like gRPC out of the box. I haven't tried any other options other than a simple REST API, but I'm glad that they are there. I worked with GraphQL and gRPC with PHP, and they are getting more popular as time goes on. Like Express, there is a lot of things Nest does not enforce. So authentication, validation, and most importantly, database communication must be added separately. However, Nest has great integration with some popular libraries, and adding them is pretty straightforward, although it does take some work to set it up optimally for some of them. Nest is actually quite popular, which I think is one of the most important things about the framework. Okay, let's talk about what I use in each application. In both Laravel and Nest, I use a MySQL database, and for tests, I use an in-memory SQLite database to be able to execute tests faster. To set up the MySQL tables, Laravel uses migration files, where it provides an API for defining the table structure. Then for queries, Laravel uses a package called Eloquent. It uses an active record pattern, and it's quite flexible and nice to work with. Table rows are represented with module classes. In my Nest application for database communication, I use the TypeORM package because it is recommended by Nest framework, and it has great integration with it. While Laravel has models, TypeORM has entities. The main difference is that TypeORM uses the data mapper pattern and not the active record pattern. TypeORM does have the option to use active record pattern, but the data mapper is the default way, so I decided to stick with it. Instead of using migrations, the database structure in TypeORM can and should be defined within entity classes, somewhat like Doctrine does it in PHP. TypeORM does have migrations, but they are mostly used for updating the database schema on production environments. For development purposes, they are not necessary. Okay, it's time to see some code examples where we will compare Laravel and Nest. I will do my best not to make this Laravel versus Nest, but make it more of PHP code versus TypeScript code. I'm going to talk about two amazing Laravel features, Tinker and Factories. Tinker is a part of Laravel CLI, and it is used as a REPL that includes the Laravel application context, so you can tinker around, test things, whatever you want. A REPL is an acronym for Read, Evaluate, Print Loop, and it is just a CLI app that takes user input, executes it, and returns the results to the user. So let me show you how it works. Since I'm using Docker, I must access Tinker through it. So Docker execute in Laravel PHP container the command PHP RC. Since here we have the application loaded, the Laravel application loaded, we can access any of its features right here. For example, app function gives us the application instance, and we can use it, for example, to get objects from the IOC container. So, for example, in object, like a user object, user model, which we can also make queries, which are the most useful thing to do here in Tinker. So, for example, let's fetch all users. As we can see, we have 3 users here with ID 1, 2, and 3. We can, since we can make any type of query, let's, for example, call it 2 users. Get the result. So here we have the 2 users. We can assign the users to a variable, and then we can make that variable whatever we want. For example, let's just take the name of each user, and here we have printed the 3 names. We can also see what 1 + 1 is, and basically whatever we want. So I use this tool very often, and I wanted something like that for my Node application. So if Laravel has Tinker, I made something similar and called it Pinker. So Pinker is just a script that should be required when launching the regular Node REPL, and it will start the Nest application. It will require some modules and register them as global variables so that we can immediately start using them in the REPL, and so we don't have to require anything manually. It should also be used with the experimental top level await parameter when starting the Tinker. So let's see how that looks. Again, I'm using Docker, so I want to execute in the Nest app container the command npm untitled. Here we can see the Nest application loading, and here we can see all the registered variables that we can use immediately. For example, like the global app function is located in Laravel, here we have the app variable registered globally, and also, like in Laravel, we can use it for resolving classes from the IOC container, similar to Laravel. So this is the app instance, and we can get user repository, and we have here printed the whole repository object. If I type globals, you can see everything that is registered globally. So, for example, we can use a user repository to fetch all the users. But if I press enter, I would just get a promise. And this is where the top level await gets very useful. So I have to await the result from this function. And here I can see the 3 users fetched from the database. Again, I can use the repository to make any kind of query. For example, I want to take only 2 users. And here we have printed the 2 users. And again, we can do a variable, await, that repo, find users. And now we can, for example, like in Laravel, take only the names. So we need to want to map the users, and for each user, I want to take his or her name. And here I have an array of the 3 users. Again, we can see what 1 plus 1 is, and whatever we want. So while we are here in Tinker and Pinker, we can check out the factory function. This function can be used to create models and see the data to the database. And let's start with Laravel. So for example, we can create a new user by using the factory function, specify a factory for a user, and we create one instance. Here is the new user with ID of 4. Now, if we take from the database only the names of users, we can see that we have 4 users now. And of course, we can use the factory to create more than 1 user. And here we specify the amount that we want, for example, 3. Then again, call the create function. And now we have 3 more users, and that gives us a total of 7 users. In order for the factory function to work, we need to have a user factory defined. And that looks like this. So here we have a factory function defined for the user model. And this function uses the Faker library to generate different types of data. In this case, we use Faker to generate a name and an email. The password here is hard-coded to password, and the role is just set to a default client role. This function here generates all the attributes. A user object is created, and the arrow is saved to the database. In Nest.js, I had an option to use a package for type ORM that adds factories, but I didn't quite like it, so I created my own factory function. So let's take a look at the user factory definition that I use in the Nest application. So again, very similarly, we have a define function which defines a factory for the user entity. We pass a function which creates the fields for the entity. We have the Faker package here again, like we do in Laravel. And again, we generate the name and email with the Faker package. Here we use the hash function to hash the password, and we can assign the role in the same way as in Laravel. So let's see how we can use this in Pinker. So create a user. We have the factory function already imported, so we can use it right away, factory, for the user entity. And here, the registered user class is quite useful. And we can again call the create function and create a user. So we can see that user here. To create many users, different here, we create a factory for user and then call the create many function. Let's specify how many users we want. So 3. And if we print those 3 users, here we can see the 3 users that are created. And await user repository and count how many we have now. It's 7. And that's what we expected. And the main purpose of the factory method is to create data for test, basically. So let's go to tests now, and let's take a look at a test in Laravel. Okay, so Laravel uses the PHP unit package, and the tests are written as classes. So here we want to test a successful login. First, we create one user in the database using factories. Then we make a post request to the login route, like this. And we send an email and password as credentials. And finally, we check if the response is successful. And we check if the response body is what we expected. Now let's take a look at the same example in Node. I'm using the Jest package for tests here. And instead of classes, it uses global functions to organize tests. So in same steps as in Laravel app, we create a user right here. This create user function is just a helper basically for factory for user. Just let me make sure I have everything imported. Then we make a post request to the login route. We send the email and password as credentials. We check if the response is successful, and we check if the response body has the expected data that we want. Let's take a look at another test when we test login failure. So here it is. Again, we create a user. We make a post request to the login route. We send an email and password, but we send the wrong password. And then we check if the response status code is 401, and we check if we have the expected body. Again, in Node, we have the same thing. Create a user, make a post requested login route, send email and wrong password, expect the 401 status code, and expect a certain body in the response. Okay, before I run these tests, let me show you something cool about TypeScript. When using factories, we can override the default fields that a factory creates. So back in Laravel, when creating a user, I can, for example, pass a custom name, for example, John. And this is a very important feature of the factory function. But in PHP, there is no way to have IntelliSense for this. The IDE cannot tell me which fields I can override. So basically, I have to know on top of my head or to check somewhere which fields user has. But in TypeScript, we do have the possibility for this. So if we go back here to the Node app, and here in the factory function in the create method, start overwriting field, get IntelliSense. Or at least, oh, here they are at the bottom for some reason. So we have the IntelliSense that tells us we can have the created at field, email, ID, name, password, hosts, role, or updated at. For example, I can just take a name and pass a name here. Also, since the name is a string, or it should be the string, if I pass a number here, it will complain. Type number is not assignable to type string, null, or undefined. So we have to specify a string. Okay, so let's run these tests. Let me just remove this part of the code here and here. We'll exit the REPL. Okay, first for Laravel, we'll only run the login test. As you can see, it took less than 1 second, 800 milliseconds. Let's do it again. Case 700 milliseconds. So let's do the same for Node. We will also run only the login test. Keep in mind that the tests are somewhat slower because of the connection with the presentation. But in any case, these are a lot slower. Let's do it one more time. .11 seconds. So in jest, actually the time varies for me between 3 seconds and 10 seconds. So it's quite slower than Laravel tests. So why are Node tests slower here than PHP tests? Shouldn't Node be faster than PHP? Well, yes, a deployed Node app is indeed faster than a deployed PHP app, but tests are just slower. Now, I've spent a lot of time trying to optimize tests to figure out if I can speed them up, but with no luck. I thought that TypeScript compilation step, which happens on every test run, is to blame, but that doesn't seem to be the case. I've tried Jest, I've tried Mocha, I've tried running tests on compiled test files in the dist folder so that the TypeScript compilation step is skipped. But nothing helped in speeding up tests significantly. I will keep trying to figure them out, and if there is a way to speed them up, but for now I'm gonna have to be okay with the speed that I have. One thing that I'm not sure of is what would happen when the number of tests start rising. Of course, both PHP and Node tests will take more time. But it would be interesting to see how the test execution time increases in relation to the number of tests. Okay, so we are done with the code part of this presentation. And let's summarize. Again, as I said, choose the right tool for you. If you want to learn Node, start with writing a server without any package. Just use the Node API. It will take you 5 minutes. Then make a simple Express or Koa app to understand middleware and routing with Node. As I said, Nest.js is not a complete web framework. It does not contain everything you need. If you do want a complete web framework, I would recommend you check out Meteor or Adonis.js 5. Adonis is actually completely based on Laravel, but I didn't like how Adonis 4 works. In version 5, they've rewritten the whole framework in TypeScript, which is awesome, but it is still in beta, I think, and it's simply not as popular as Nest. I would actually really like for it to gain more traction with the version 5. If it wasn't obvious for larger apps, I would recommend Nest.js. For me, it's been difficult to set up everything exactly like I've wanted, but I learned a lot and I had a lot of fun with it. Or you can just keep using Laravel, whatever you prefer. Thanks for listening. You can find the repositories that I used in this presentation on my GitHub page. Here are the links to it. And now we can take a look if there are any questions. Question context. You mentioned that you considered only one other language to move from PHP, which was Python. Personally, I do not like the Java ecosystem, nor the Microsoft stack C#, .NET, MVC. Why did you circumvent these two options? Java and C#, they are too verbose, too complicated for example, doing a startup, but I can assume that most people just want to learn something new, get a job, or just gain some knowledge, and Java and C# will take more time, and the one thing that you can gain from them is they're more low level, they're statically typed languages, so you can gain more knowledge of how things work, but I don't think they're practical in most cases. Thoughts on Dino? I like Dino very much. I really hope that it gains traction, and I hope that it becomes maybe not a replacement for Node. Node is so far ahead, but I would, if it gains traction, I would really like to work in Deno more than in Node, actually. Why you not recommend Express framework? I came from Laravel, and Laravel gives you a lot of things, helps you get started, gives you a lot of tools out of the box, and that is what I looked in Node frameworks. I didn't find that in Express, and also, as I said, in Express I would have to spend extra time trying to figure out the best way to make the architecture be like I want it to be, and with Nest, that step was basically done for me, and I think that is a very big step. And also, Nest is written in TypeScript, which I also really like. When AI will take over the world? Not soon, don't worry. Does Java give more in the domain of security than Node and PHP? That's a hard question. I'm not sure I can answer it, but in general, the more important thing is good programmers than which language you use. Thoughts on Node.js CMSs? I tried Keystone.js versus PHP CMS, example WordPress, the most popular one. Well, I would guess Node.js CMSs are faster. If you want a full stack CMS, I I can't recommend any. I haven't actually used any of them. I haven't actually used WordPress also, but I think WordPress is the main advantage of WordPress is you have any plugin you want, you can find for WordPress. For Node.js CMS, you should find the most popular one and try that one out. But I guess that Node.js CMSs will be faster than PHP ones. And if you need a headless CMS, then Node.js is probably the way to go. Okay. I think that those are all the questions. I will scroll up a bit. Sorry for the keyboard, yeah. Okay, I think there are no more questions, so thank you again for listening, and bye.